Buonasera, buonasera e benvenuti a tutti, benvenuti all'Italian Academy. Good evening and welcome to the Italian Academy. I am Barbara Faedda, the Academy's Associate Director, and I'm glad to welcome you all to our annual symposium on the Day of Remembrance. Every year, the Academy broadens its focus to explore other groups that were targeted in the racism and xenophobia of the Nazi and Fascist regimes, and that suffered and died along with the millions of Jews. The Roma and Sinti, the homosexuals, and this year, people with disabilities. They too were subject to persecution as part of radical public health policy aimed at excluding unfit Germans from the national community. From the first two speakers from the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, we will learn about the Nazi Euthanasia Program and the concept of master race, while from our colleague from NYU, we will hear more about exclusion and marginality, especially in Italy. The Academy's symposium is part of a rich program organized and coordinated with our friends and colleagues from the Primo Levi Center, New York University's Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimont, the Calander Italian-American Institute, the Italian Cultural Institute, and the Italian Consulate in New York. And I'd like to especially welcome the Italian Consul General Natalia Brintavalle. Grazie per essere qui stasera. So our speakers. Susan Bachrach is curator of special exhibitions at the Holocaust Museum. She is currently working on a new exhibition for April. Some Were Neighbors, Collaboration and Complicity in the Holocaust. Her last exhibition, Deadly Medicine, is presently traveling to venues across the country. Since joining the museum in 1992, Dr. Bachrach has worked on many exhibitions and catalogs, including Liberation 1945, Nazi Olympics Berlin 1936, and Nazi propaganda. Patricia Heberer has served as an historian with the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the Holocaust Museum since 1994. She is specialist on medical crimes and eugenics. She did doctoral work at the Freie University of Berlin and has a PhD from the University of Maryland. She contributes to several Holocaust Museum publications and has recently authored a source edition, Children During the Holocaust, and co-edited Atrocity on Trial, The Politics of Prosecuting War Crimes in Historical Perspective. David Forgacs holds the Guido and Mariuccia Zerilli-Marimont Chair of Contemporary Italian Studies at New York University. His publications include Mass Culture and Italian Society from Fascism to the Cold War, and Italian Culture in the Industrial Era. His latest book, Italy's Margins, Photography, Writing, and Social Exclusion since 1861, will be published by Cambridge University Press in 2013. At the end of the talks, we will have a very short Q&A session, and then we can keep talking over drinks on the first floor. Now, please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm delighted to be here on the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance. My program is based on an exhibition that the exhibit developed, that opened at the exhibit several years ago, 2004 actually, and is still Trauma and Deadly Medicine, Creating the Master Race. This exhibition traces the arc from the history of eugenics in Germany before Hitler took power, with a nod to eugenics in the US and some other countries. Eugenics as it was applied very radically in Nazi Germany after Hitler took power in 1933. And then during the wartime, when there was a turn to euthanasia, which a so-called Euthanasia Program, which became a model of sorts for the mass murder of Jews. I'm going to have a very shortened program tonight and talk just mostly about the eugenic aspect of this, and then my colleague Patricia Heberer will talk about the Euthanasia Program and some victims of the Euthanasia Program. Can everyone hear me okay? In the early 20th century, there were proponents of eugenics in Germany and elsewhere, as we know, in the United States. And it's an important point that they could be found in both the political left and right. And that there were many supporters within the academic community and within scientific and medical circles. It wasn't simply a popular movement. It did have a very popular period. Many of the advocates of eugenics supported ideas that were utopian or dystopian, aimed at some kind of perfection of the human race, how they define that. So there were two aspects, and please forgive me if you're familiar with this history. For those who are not, I'll just run through it very quickly. There was positive eugenics, and this was the language of the day, and negative eugenics. And positive eugenics aimed at increasing the number of people who are considered very fit in the Darwinian language, very contributing to the health of the whole population in a positive way, people who consider it to be mentally healthy, hopefully to have a certain degree of intelligence and so forth, however that was defined. And then there was the negative eugenics aimed at controlling the births of people who did not have these characteristics. So people who had mental illness, and especially people who might be institutionalized, and some of us remember this was a period of really large public hospitals for mentally ill persons, and other categories of individuals, and you'll see as I show you some slides. Now, there were a number of things that came together in the early 20th century that really promoted support for eugenics. Of course, there was the Darwinian Revolution, and there was a rediscovery, we all remember from our biology classes, of Mendel's laws of heredity. That gave a huge boost to belief and ideas about the importance of heredity. And then there were a lot of crushing social problems. This was the period of industrialization, urbanization, and so forth. Eugenics, there were slightly different problems in different countries and different demographic issues depending on the particular setting. If we look at Germany, there was a big concern with poverty and crowding, the kind of condition that fostered tuberculosis and other illnesses. You had these huge cities like this spewing all kinds of things into the air, and the increase in cancer and all kinds of things. So eugenics began as a reform movement that was looking at real problems, social and others. This is a poster from a international hygiene exhibition that was held in Dresden, Germany in 1911. It's international, and the supporters of eugenics formed an international community, just as people in the medical and scientific fields corresponded with each other on these issues. This exhibition did have a small discussion of eugenics and eugenic policies in various countries. Now, the method of sterilizing people, I think it was a surgical procedure that came in to being around 1909 or something like that. So it's just the beginning of the possibility of that as a form of negative eugenics. So there's not so much happening on that score yet. And as you can see, this is a very beautiful, positive promise of science is evoked by this in some way. Then we have World War I, which is demographically devastating for certain countries, particularly Germany. This evokes huge losses, a whole generation of fathers that lost, and that is lost, and that gives another huge impetus to pronatal push that's also underpinned by kind of soft eugenics. This is from the Weimar period. Beautiful design, evoking kind of that Bauhaus era that we think of so positively. Healthy woman, healthy nation. Focus on women's reproductive health with a soft underpinning of positive eugenics, increase the number of live, healthy births. A problem, we're crowding in psychiatric hospitals. This is from 1930. The field of psychiatry is a very, very important field in Germany as well as in the US in terms of support for eugenics. It's very, very important in Germany. And 1930, of course, is not a good year economically, so there's the additional issue of the cost of care. And that's a constant thing that underpins discussion of eugenics as a way to improve the health of populations. The argument's always being used that we'll save on the cost of care. Certainly that argument has not totally disappeared from our discourse, I don't think. There's a focus in Germany and other countries on research. Not that much was known about mental illness at this time. Lundberg was actually a Swede. There was great focus on family pedigrees and trying to track. And of course, these kind of family histories are still used clinically to some degree. As I've said, and some of you probably know, eugenics did have support in Western Europe. This is a poster from the English Eugenics Society from 1930s. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. You can still see this Darwinian language, or social Darwinian language being used here. There's a constant analogy made between improvements that could be made in the field of agriculture to breeding better human beings. What's the difference? There was an effort in England to pass a national sterilization law that failed. This is a Norwegian scientist showing the operation of Mendel's laws of heredity. And here's an American eugenics display in the mid-1920s, probably posted at a lot of state fairs. That was a popular venue. Some people were born to be a burden on the rest. Learn about heredity, you can help to correct these conditions. And this was a very early interactive display because lights flashed. For example, the light at the top flashed every 15 seconds because it claimed that every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes to the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. And then it goes through various, I always like this one. Every 50 seconds, a person is committed to jail in the United States. Very few normal persons ever go to jail. So there were links made constantly between biology and criminality, between biology and morality, and so forth. This is Carrie Buck and her mother at a home in Lynchburg, Virginia. Carrie Buck was the subject of a very important Supreme Court case that was decided in 1927 by v. Bauer, which the eminent Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion in which he said, the court upheld the Virginia state sterilization law. And he wrote, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The very famous, notorious line referring to Carrie's mother and Carrie's baby. And of course, they're very primitive intelligence tests at these time, but the Holmes and the rest of the court were making this decision on the basis of information presented by experts. Then we get to the Nazi Germany, 1933. Hitler comes into power. Here he's shown as a doctor of the German people. There is suddenly the political opportunity to implement eugenic policies, whereas prior to this in Germany the focus was on education, research, mostly positive eugenics. The political situation did not allow the passage of a national eugenics law. Now it was possible because political opposition was eliminated. So there's a focus on positive eugenics. So there are honor crosses that are awarded bronze, silver, and gold to mothers who have the right number of children, 4, 6, or 8 or more. Hitler said the mother was the most important citizen in his state. Here is one of the honorees, as well as a whole host of other measures. There's been a book and books written about the war on smoking in Nazi Germany and so forth. A lot of people don't know about this aspect of Nazi public health. And then negative eugenics. And these are cards that show family histories from an institution for the so-called feeble-minded and numbered. And these cards, which had been kept before the Nazi era, are now used as evidence in hereditary health courts that are set up to implement a new sterilization law. That is really one of the first measures that is enacted in Nazi Germany, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. And these are the conditions that were mentioned in the law. One, congenital feeble-mindedness. Again, that's a very, very elastic category. If you're poor and uneducated, look out. Schizophrenia, manic depressive, insanity, hereditary epilepsy, and so forth down the list. The largest category was number 1 and 2 and 3. Those are the big categories. But, and I'm going to show you something, but there were also deaf Germans who were sterilized under this law, and I'm going to show you an interview that we did for the exhibition. The woman in this interview, Helga Gross, came to the U.S. after the war, and that's why you hear the English in this interview.
They explained to the deaf children that they didn't want deaf children, that they had to be sterilized because they didn't want deaf children to have children who would grow up and be deaf as well. We were young, we really didn't understand. The man that came from the government to our school told the teacher to choose which children that we should send to the hospital for sterilization. Then as the time became near, I was in the kitchen and I was cleaning. My mother came and said, Helga, sit down. And she explained, you have to go to the hospital in 2 days. My father cried. He refused to see me. He didn't want to hug me before I left home to go to the hospital. Not until later, years later, I saw my baby sister. She had a beautiful baby. The baby was so beautiful, and I got to hold the baby. And that morning, my sister was feeding the baby, and then I realized what I felt when I realized I couldn't have any children. I started to cry, and I ran into the bathroom and just cried and cried. When I came back out, my sister said, what's wrong? What's the matter? I said, oh, I'm just crying because I'm happy for you because you have a beautiful child.
So that was very common of sterilization victims, that they were in their teens when they had this procedure, and they didn't realize until they were older what had really happened. In fact, some were told that they were having an appendix removed. Approximately 400,000 Germans were sterilized under this law, most of them before the war began in 1939. So that was a real radicalization and a radical application of eugenics policy. In the United States, there were many individuals sterilized on a much smaller scale because in the US, these laws were a matter of individual states, and there were a number of states where many states where you could not get this kind of law, and then in many states the law was not really enforced. Generally it involved the superintendent of an institution who wanted to use this, and sometimes it's for very complicated reasons. And California was one of the states where there were the most sterilizations in, I think it occurred in several large state mental hospitals, and often the sterilization was done and it was contingent upon the release of the patient. So it was a cost-saving measure for the hospitals, and so it's not a total straightforward ideological kind of thing why this was happening. But I'd just like to say in closing, before I turn over the floor to Patricia, that I just hope that all of this is a warning. You know, when the Holocaust Museum first developed this exhibit and the idea for the exhibit, it was way back in the 90s when there was a lot of talk in the air about cloning human beings, and the Human Genome Project had barely begun. There was a lot of there's a lot of optimism about the positive things that medicine and science could yield, without kind of thinking and seriously about where that kind of thinking had led us in the past. And that's one of the reasons why we did this exhibit, so that people would learn about this history and reflect on it, and young people and medical students and so forth would be aware of this, so that we wouldn't even begin to go down that same path again. But thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? All these tall people, down to little old me. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Barbara, Faedda, and the kind people here at the Italian Academy for inviting me to come and speak with all of you tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. A little caveat, many of the people I'm going to be discussing tonight, I've changed their names in order to protect their identity and their privacy, as well as those of their surviving relatives. That's a part of the compact that we make when we use these particular files. But I hope that This provides, along with Susan's presentation and the one that's still to come, some food for thought this evening. Ida and Sophie Benz were sisters, born to the local Lutheran pastor and his wife in the village of Haslach, Bavaria. Sophie, born in 1861, and Ida, 18 months later, had a normal upbringing and, remaining unmarried, moved to the Swabian city of Augsburg in southern Germany, where they shared an apartment. Their brothers saw to their wants through their mutual inheritance, and as the sisters grew elderly, he arranged for the two to be put together and lodged together at the city's Paulinenstift, a retirement home run by the Lutheran Church. On the evening of the 25th of February, 1944, Allied aircraft launched a first massive bombing on the city of Augsburg. During the night, the Paulinenstift residence was heavily damaged in the bombardment. Among its frightened inhabitants who were evacuated that evening were Ida and Sophie Benz. As their brother himself now lived in a nursing home and could not take them in, local officials placed the two sisters on a transport of elderly individuals bound for the sanatorium Kaufbeuren, 30 kilometers to the south. Ida and Sophie arrived at the mental health facility on 27 February 1944, where Kaufbeuren personnel recorded that their committal was actually due to a bombing raid on the city of Augsburg. That's actually written in the diagnosis line. A physician diagnosed further that the sisters had senile dementia, noting that their illness dated from the 25th of February, the night of the bombing. Ida, the younger sister, seemed particularly confused and frightened, and Sophie, more composed, insisted upon staying so that she could care for her. In subsequent days, caretakers observed that Ida still exhibited marked disorientation, and in her terror continued to soil her bed. 5 months later, Ida was dead. Sophie, alone and unclaimed by family members, remained at the facility for another year. On the 5th of April, 1945, she died, perhaps as a result of systematic starvation, just 2 weeks before American troops arrived in the region. Both Ida and Sophie Benz number among the hundreds of victims murdered at the Kaufbeuren facility as a result of the Nazis' so-called Euthanasia Program. And you've seen this photograph already with Susan, we'll see it again. The Euthanasia Program represented one of many radical measures, as we've seen from Susan's talk tonight, which aimed to restore the racial integrity, quote unquote, of the German nation. The effort aimed to eliminate what Nazis deemed or called life unworthy of life, those who, because of cognitive or intellectual impairment, severe physical disability, or incurable mental illness, were seen to pose both a genetic and financial burden upon the state. Representing the regime's first program of mass murder, as Susan's already stated, the euthanasia effort targeted for killing mentally and physically disabled patients housed in institutional settings throughout Germany and German and ex-territories, places like Austria. In October 1939, Philipp Buhle, the director of Hitler's private chancellery, the Führer Chancellery, and Karl Brandt, who would later become the chief defendant in the Nuremberg doctors' trial, instituted a child euthanasia program through which 5,000 to 7,000 German, I want to stress these are German children and mainly non-Jewish children, were murdered during the war years through starvation and lethal overdoses of medication. By January 1940, an adult killing program paralleled the murder of German infants, toddlers, and juveniles, codenamed Operation T4, and that's a picture of one of these children who was murdered. The program for adults, codenamed Operation T4 for the address of its Berlin headquarters near Potsdamer Platz in central Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4, T4. The program organized the removal of disabled patients from their home facilities to one of eventually 6 killing centers throughout Germany and Austria. Within hours of their arrival at these facilities, patients were gassed in specially designed gas chambers to look like showers with carbon monoxide gas, and their body was burned in specially designed crematory ovens. According to T4, the euthanasia program's own internal statistics, 70,273 mentally and physically disabled persons, again Germans, the vast minority non-Jews, were murdered at these 6 gassing installations between January 1940 and late August 1941. The program was a clandestine one on German soil, but the program quickly became an open secret. And on the 24th of August 1941, at a critical point in the war effort, the Germans had just invaded the Soviet Union that summer. Adolf Hitler himself called a halt to the T4 program, and for roughly 1 year, the adult euthanasia program lingered in a kind of stasis, during which over 100 T4 functionaries were recruited by the planners of the final solution to serve as German personnel in extermination camps, Welsich, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Between them, these 3 camps claimed the lives of over 1.5 million Jews during the course of 1942 through 1943 in German-occupied Poland. In the summer months of 1942, however, the killing of institutionalized adult patients resumed in Germany, albeit on a more decentralized format or decentralized level than before. Murder by lethal overdose and starvation, those modes that had proven so successful in child euthanasia, continued at a broad number of German institutions throughout Germany and Austria until the defeat of Germany in the spring of 1945. Considered by many historians, as Susan has mentioned, as a precursor to the final solution, the genocide of European Jewry, the euthanasia program claimed the lives of over 200,000 individuals, most of them, again, German citizens. Historical assessment of the Nazi euthanasia program remains a work in progress. Since the 1980s, when the efforts of German researchers began to attract scholarly interest to this topic, the contours of T4 euthanasia policy have been pretty solidly delineated, yet our knowledge of the euthanasia effort remains imperfect. Until recently, very little scholarly attention has focused on reconstructing the lives and experiences of euthanasia victims. A preoccupation with how the murder campaign actually functioned has worked to overshadow their individual existences and to obscure their identities. Documentation is difficult. Many patient files have been lost or destroyed, while very strict German privacy laws have ensured that the bulk of these medical records, at least until recently, have remained sealed or inaccessible to scholars. Recent research, however, not only by myself, but of scholars like me in Germany, have tried to work to fill in the holes and the gaps with regard to the nature and identity of euthanasia victims in recent years. In the year 2000, the Kaufbeuren Regional Hospital, still a functioning mental health facility, by the way, granted access of its extant wartime patient records to the archive of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, my institution and Susan's. The resulting record group contains patient files of some 1,500 individuals, the vast majority of whom died at the institution under the auspices of the euthanasia program. And based on 500 samples, this presentation I'm going to discuss this evening provides a kind of composite for those individuals who died, lived and died, I should say, at this facility. And so seen through this filter of physicians and caregivers as they chronicle these histories in administrative records, these files allow us a glimpse of the individual experiences of euthanasia victims. Kaufbeuren began its tenure as a sanatorium and a long-term care unit in the region of Swabia in southern Germany, that's a district of Bavaria, in about 1876. Under the direction of Valentin Fackelhauser, Kaufbeuren commenced direct collaboration with the euthanasia program in December 1941 with the establishment of a children's killing ward. By late 1945, 209 infants, toddlers, and juveniles had been murdered at the facility. The practice of adult euthanasia at Kaufbeuren began in 1943 and gained momentum in the following year. About 1,350 adult patients died at the facility as a result of euthanasia during the war years at Kaufbeuren. Among euthanasia facilities, Kaufbeuren possesses a particularly notorious reputation for 2 reasons. First, because it was one of several Bavarian institutions for which murder through systematic starvation was institutional policy. In addition to the killing of patients by lethal overdoses of medication, victims at Kaufbeuren suffered lingering deaths by the so-called starvation regimen. Second, Kaufbeuren was shocking proof to post-war authorities of the ingrained nature of the killing process among euthanasia personnel. In late April 1945, American forces occupying the region near Augsburg murdered the killing center at Kaufbeuren and arrested its leading officials. On the 29th of May, an American Army Medical Corps unit revisiting the institution made a gruesome discovery. 21 days following the end of war in the European theater and 31 days after the facility had been liberated, Kaufbeuren patients, or rather Kaufbeuren nurses, were still killing their patients. The last died by lethal overdose just hours before the soldiers' arrival for inspection. So, recent recognition that there have been many more starvation deaths among euthanasia victims, as well as this very interesting example that there's this entrenched nature of the killing process among Kaufbeuren personnel and staff at the facility are, I think, two compelling reasons which encourage us to take a closer look at the nature of euthanasia practice at Kaufbeuren, as we can see reflected through these patient files. But let's start with a case study. This is Lawrence Bauer. I apologize for the bad exposure of the film. These are from these very old patient files, and they were very damp and moldy when we originally acquired them. This is Lawrence Bauer. He was born in Stadtbergen, Bavaria, to peasant farmers in August 1883. He had a normal schooling. At the age of 18, went into compulsory military service. Upon discharge, his family remarked on the youth's changed character, and in 1912, Bauer, as a 19-year-old, began to manifest the first symptoms of schizophrenia. That year, he was committed to the Kaufbeuren facility on the order of police authorities, but improved enough to be released a few months later and given to the custody of his brother. Bauer had earlier apprenticed as a mason, and now he moved to Augsburg to take up his trade. Things went well into the summer of 1921, when Lawrence began again to demonstrate violent behavior, threatening his brother with an axe. For the second time, he was committed to Kaufbeuren as a danger to the community. A longtime patient at the facility, Bauer worked for many of his 24 years at Kaufbeuren as a field hand. And despite a few disruptive episodes, he was viewed by hospital staff in 1942 as the most diligent worker in the woodyard. In 1943, Bauer expressed remorse to nursing staff that a foot injury kept him from working out of doors. When the swelling in his foot reoccurred in late 1944, he complained to attending physicians that he could not recover sufficiently to go back to work because he did not receive adequate rations as a non-worker. The injury lingered, and within a few weeks, Bauer was transferred to the Irsee wing of the facility, where he was murdered by a lethal overdose of medication. A careful reading of euthanasia patient files like Lawrence Bauer's can reveal a number of details regarding the functioning of a killing center like Kaufbeuren and the process of euthanasia as it evolved at the particular institution. For example, Mr. Bauer's story indicates something historians have long known about the euthanasia program, that the ability or inability to work represented an important factor in including or excluding patients from the killing measure. Undeniably, in both phases of adult euthanasia, the gassing phase from 1940 to 1941 and the 42 to 45 phase, as we see it at Kaufbeuren, the criterion of labor might establish reprieve for patients as useful workers or doom them to the destruction process. Administrators clearly placed an emphasis on retaining those patients able to work at the facility. Those who could received extra rations. Hunger and medication confined the incapacitated to their beds and function as a twin dynamic, reducing the strength and resolve of until their existence was cut short by malnutrition, disease, or an overdose of narcotics. The other factor which Lawrence Bauer illustrates is the issue of long-term care patients living in euthanasia facilities. One thing that struck me as I began to look through the data that I gathered was that a full third of the patients in this study, 33%, had been committed to a mental health facility, for less than 1 year. Before November 1942, the Euthanasia Program's registration process, the way they brought people into the program, had set a kind of standard by including only those who lived in an institution or more than one institution for more than 5 years, thus focusing on people who needed long-term care. Clearly now, as this killing program radicalized in late 1944, Kaufbeuren personnel had fewer compunctions about killing the less impaired, or individuals with a reasonable chance of recovery, those who had been committed to a facility for a relatively short time frame, and included those with so-called incurables in the destruction process. There were, of course, individuals like Lawrence Bauer, who lived at Kaufbeuren for a long time, 24 years, and he fits the patterns of those individuals very closely. Only 10% of Kaufbeuren's patients belonged to this circle of long-term care patients, long-term Kaufbeuren patients, housed at the facility before it became a euthanasia center. These individuals are very interesting, and there are two specific aspects connected with them. First, long-term patients comprised a significant number of those who did survive the facility as a killing site. When the Americans came in, there were several hundred patients who still survived the facility. This suggests that the patients had been retained, as historians have long suspected, because they were good workers. Kaufbeuren, like many facilities in Germany in this period, employed patient labor for this facility's menial tasks, a concept that was thought both therapeutic for the patient and, of course, economically advantageous for the institution itself. Likewise, many long-term patients, like Bauer, were locals from the community, from Augsburg and the surrounding countryside, who'd been committed to Kaufbeuren directly. That's to say, they weren't transferred as a part of the Euthanasia Program to that facility, and many received frequent visits from friends and loved ones. The abrupt disappearance of these individuals might have raised doubts among family members, and perhaps these individuals were spared in order to avert local suspicion. It's extremely interesting to note that many of these long-term patients survived until the very last months of the war and died in incredibly large numbers in March and April of 1945 before American troops arrived at the facility. Unlike Lawrence Bauer, Maria Dorpelin spent a very brief time at Kaufbeuren. On the evening of the 2nd of March 1944, a transport of elderly individuals arrived at the facility. Among these patients were several residents of the Albertusheim, an old age home which had been damaged, like the ladies at the beginning of my story, in the bombing of Augsburg a week earlier. The group appeared at the institution well ahead of their administrative records, and although most of them had identity papers of some kind with them, one female remained unidentified. The elderly woman spoke tenderly to the nurses who helped her into bed, but could not give caregivers pertinent information about herself or her family members. She was diagnosed with senile dementia and had to be secured to her bed with restraints. As with so many elderly Kaufbeuren patients, incontinence and a constant need for care proved a death sentence. And on the 15th of March 1944, this still nameless woman was murdered with a lethal overdose of medication. In the days that followed, her records finally arrived, and Kaufbeuren were finally able to identify the dead woman, Maria Dorpelin, born in 1870. Dorpelin had long been a productive member of her town, Dillingen on the Danube, not so far away from Kaufbeuren, where her late husband, a high-ranking civil servant, had served as mayor. In her widowhood, she had been a quiet and orderly retirement home resident. Once at Kaufbeuren, she was dead within 2 weeks. Maria Dorpelin's history raises significant detail in our narrative. It's true that the euthanasia campaign in this second, more decentralized phase, 1942 through 1945, continued to target as its chief victims the institutionalized, mentally ill, and physically disabled. Schizophrenia, epilepsy, and this hereditary feeble-mindedness that Susan mentioned in her talk were the chief disorders on which Kaufbeuren victims, in other words, those who died at the facility, were initially committed. Strikingly, however, the next highest percentages of diagnoses at committal among murdered patients were arteriosclerosis, the old hardening of the arteries, and senile dementia, both impairments of old age. In fact, the number of geriatric deaths was the most unsettling discovery I encountered in regard when I was looking at these files. So let's be clear. 56% of the people who died at Kaufbeuren, who were murdered there between 1941 and 1945, died victims of adult euthanasia. That is, they were people over the age of 18, in their majority, who had for a long time suffered from mental illness, intellectual disability, or some severe physical disability. The site was a famous venue for child euthanasia, and 18% of the victims who died there were young children and juveniles, up to the age of 18. But 17% of the cases in the sample, however, represented geriatric victims, individuals suffering from infirmities of old age, like senility, disorientation, stroke, or the cognitive impairment that we associate with Alzheimer's disease, without other pathology related to mental illness. I should note that from March 1941, the euthanasia planners, Brandt and Bauer, who we met at the beginning of my talk, had set guidelines expressly forbidding the murders of elderly persons with dementia, as far as they hadn't earlier exhibited earlier signs of mental illness or neurological disorders. Many of Kaufbeuren's geriatric victims, like Mary Dorpelin, or the ladies that I talked about in the beginning of my talk, were elderly victims of Allied bombings on cities like Augsburg or Dresden, or they were evacuees from the East from the last months of the war. Injured and disoriented, many of these individuals were temporarily housed in welfare institutions or hospitals for observation or until relatives could come and collect them. And under the auspices of Operation Brandt, named for Karl Brandt, whom we met earlier, Operation Brandt synchronized the euthanasia program with local and regional disaster planning so that municipal authorities in need of bed space for more valuable civilian or military casualties often dispatched these elderly individuals, almost invariably female, of advanced age and without family, to their deaths at T4 sites like Kaufbeuren. The case history of Walter Graf illustrates a final point. In early childhood, Graf developed encephalitis and began suffering frequent epileptic seizures. He was 8 when he was committed to the Rotenburg facility near Hanover, northern Germany. In his late teens, he developed skills to work as a cobbler. In 1938, his caretakers noticed that the young man loved to play practical jokes on his fellow patients, but in the workshop, he was quiet, industrious, and efficient. At this juncture, he stood as an adult 5'8", 5'8" tall, and weighed 145 pounds. He'd always been in good health, but by 1941, he began to experience more numerous seizures. As his physical condition deteriorated, he managed still to work in the garden, but consistently found himself weak and incontinent. He was transferred to Kaufbeuren, where his physical decline continued. In the last month of his life at Kaufbeuren, subjected to a starvation diet, Walter Graf lost 10 kilograms, 22 pounds in 4 weeks. When he died on the 27th of March, 1944, he was 32 years old and weighed 70 pounds. The next photograph is not Walter Graf, but it is an alarming photograph, so if you are sensitive to those things, you might not want to look. Graf was one of many Kaufbeuren patients who suffered a languishing death by starvation. Originally, when I began this project, I wondered how I might establish by what means individual patients met their deaths. What I hadn't counted on was the invaluable cooperation of Kaufbeuren personnel who kept detailed and accurate monthly weight charts of each individual. So in my sample, about 23% of these individuals, you could tell by the accurate weight chart that they had died through starvation, like Walter Graf and like this individual who was found by American authorities in April 1945. In 20% of the cases, the duration of the stay was very short, which indicated probably that this individual had died from a medical overdose. In nearly half of the cases, there was inadequate data to establish one way or the other. So obviously, this is a preliminary outline of issues that I and other scholars want to follow and further analyze. This is still a work in progress, as I said, yet some of the trends in this study are illuminating and I think merit further investigation. The high percentage of these geriatric victims without significant psychiatric pathology deviates from our standard assumption that the euthanasia program claimed the lives only of the severely mentally and physically disabled because they ostensibly compromised Germany's genetic and economic resources. Likewise, the murder of elderly bombing victims, largely under the aegis of Operation Brandt, suggests that the exigencies of total war widen that arc of intolerance for those unable to care or provide for themselves, rendering human life more and more dispensable. Both instances clearly point out to the fact that as the euthanasia program spiraled outward to embrace larger numbers of victims, foreign forced laborers who died here at Kaufbeuren, bombing victims, frontline soldiers with psychiatric episodes or traumatic head wounds. So-called ordinary Germans, too, were caught up in the cycle of destruction. These final months, 1944 and 1945, T4's machinery sort of seemed to spin out of control, extending its web to include all potential drains, or almost all potential drains on essential goods and services. And these reflections introduce as many questions as they answer. For example, when did it happen that the Euthanasia Program expanded beyond the slaying of life unworthy of life to murder those who were no longer useful to the community, even if their condition were treatable or there was no psychiatric or hereditary basis for their illness? Why did killing dramatically increase, both for long-term care patients and other patients in general in the last 6 months of the program at places like Kaufbeuren? How did the calculated starvation of patients at the facility work within the wider context of the killing apparatus? As a more organic, if you will, more organic means of killing, did it help the institution's personnel to distance themselves more easily from their responsibility as killers? These are points for further discussion and research. A dialogue which helps to explain the contours of the Euthanasia Program is ultimately a dialogue about its victims. And here the victims, though silent, still have much to tell us. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I'm going to try and connect up a bit with the two previous papers, but I'm going to go in a somewhat different direction. I don't work on the history of eugenics, and what I have done is, as Barbara Faedda mentioned, recently written a book that's coming out towards the end of this year called Italy's Margins, which is about photography and writing, dealing with various categories of socially excluded people. And I want to try and link up the work I've been doing with what the two other speakers have been talking about. What my project deals with is the way that certain people and certain places historically came to be seen and treated as marginal on the edge of society. And where the Italian story clearly overlaps with the German one, and that of many other countries, including, as Susan Bachrach mentioned, the United States and Great Britain in the first half of the 20th century, is this process of marking out certain people as unfit for participation in mainstream or normal society. People with certain kinds of physical impairment, as well as people with intellectual disabilities, and those diagnosed as having a mental illness or a behavioural disorder, whether adults or children, all came into this category. The eugenics movement became implanted in Italy from the beginning of the 20th century, and as in several other countries, there were scientists and doctors for and against it, but it certainly helped encourage the notion of marking people out as less fit, less able, defining them negatively by what they lacked, rather than positively by what they were able to do. I think, however, the difference is that although Italy had a fascist regime in power from 1922 to 1943 or 1945, depending on which bit of Italy you're talking about, it did not proceed from eugenics to systematic murder. We have no evidence that in Italy there was a policy, or a state-driven policy, of killing people in these institutions. So the difference is that Nazi Germany had official policies which were transmitted to doctors and to local officials that euthanasia, killing of people, would be carried out in the way that Patricia described. If we look at the Italian case for a minute, as I say, I'm not somebody who's specialised in this, but there is actually a good book that came out recently in English. It's a translation of a book that came out in Italian in 2006, but actually the English edition is bigger because he's added more information to it, written by Francesco Cassata. It's called, in English, Building the New Man, Eugenics, Racial Science and Genetics in 20th Century Italy. And it's published by the Central European University Press. And what Cassata shows, I think, very interestingly, is that in the fascist period, which you need to subdivide into a number of shorter sub-periods, there was a lot of interest in eugenics, but it was critical of negative eugenics. It was essentially concerned with what was called positive eugenics, in other words, building a stronger and fitter population through encouraging women to have more babies, through, on the Catholic program, encouraging reproduction only through marriage, but it was critical of any attempt to impose, for instance, what was called premarital certification, people having tests, genetic tests before marriage, and it was critical of any form of controlled contraception or sterilisation. So I think what you need to bring into play here are two traditions which existed also in Germany, but were particularly strong in Italy. One is that of the Catholic Church, which in 1930, so in the middle of the fascist period, produced an encyclical called Casti Connubii, on chaste marriages. And the other is the demographic policy of the Italian nation. Mussolini made an important speech in 1927, which was all about boosting demographic growth. It was built on the anxiety that Italy had had a declining population, it couldn't compete with nations that were more reproductively strong, and therefore a pronatalist drive was introduced in the 1920s, which wanted to build the nation, but it certainly didn't want to eliminate weaker people on its edges. Now, having said that, I think there's also evidence coming from local information that people did die in institutions. People, and this wasn't just in Italy, but people died in psychiatric institutions through illnesses that weren't properly treated, through neglect, and in some cases through acts of systematic violence, carried out by nurses with the authority of the directors of the hospitals or institutions. Children with learning difficulties were also abused, and in some cases deprived of food. We have information about that. So clearly at a micro level, there was very bad treatment of people in institutions in Italy in the 1920s, 30s, but also the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And this began to change, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, as a result of kind of radical attitudes and critique of the institutional models. Of course, it wasn't just in Italy, it was all over the world. It was in the United States, in Britain, and other parts of the world at the same time. And just to mention this, there was an important association, the Società Italiana Genetica Eugenica, SIGE, whose director was Corrado Gini, who was also the director of the Italian Statistical Institute. So he was a statistician, very much concerned with demography. He was one of the people behind Mussolini's speech on the population drive in 1927. And the assistant director was Agostino Gemelli, a very important figure in Catholic intellectual circles. Both these people were keen eugenicists, but they didn't want to have any form of selective killing. This was something that we were both very opposed to. So that when in the German law on the prevention of genetically deficient progeny, or I think hereditary diseased offspring, the one that Susan mentioned, was promulgated in July 1933, there was very severe criticism by these people. The Italian eugenicists did not support compulsory sterilisation. Now, having settled that, I want to take this a little bit towards the work that I've done. So the other people I wanted to mention are Lidio Cipriani and Guido Landra, because the other twist in this story is that at the end of the 1930s, when the fascist government in Italy moves towards the race policy, in other words, the official discrimination against Jews living in Italy, a number of anthropologists and doctors came on board and had a much more aggressive form of eugenic policy. But this didn't actually win out. It never became adopted as official state policy. They advocated for the beginnings of selective sterilization. This was always controversial, and it never won out. So this is another bit of the story that I think one needs to put into the picture. Now, coming on to photographs. What I'm interested in, coming back to what I was saying, is the way that photographs are both records of this logic of spatial separation. This is a photograph taken in 79, in one of the many long-stay psychiatric institutions in Italy that were starting to be closed down at this time, because a law of 1978, Law 180, sometimes called the Basaglia Law, that's a bit of a misnomer, was introduced, and the main purpose of this law was to begin closing long-stay institutions and to transfer psychiatric care into either the psychiatric wards of general hospitals or into community care schemes. This took a bit of time to work through, but basically all these photographs I'm going to show are taken from the period when there was a movement to close these institutions, or when they'd actually were starting to be closed down. Now, the kind of paradoxical quality of these photographs is that they are the photographs that people know and are familiar with, showing the terrible conditions of these institutions and the alienated state of these patients. Here's a man photographed naked, and here's another man waving his arms about. Now, of course, these photographs weren't taken in the period when these institutions were functioning in a repressive way, because the directors wouldn't allow photographers or filmmakers access to them. And nearly all the photographs we have from the period before the late 1960s are photographs which are sort of sanitized official pictures, clean, washed patients doing productive activities like sewing or mending or whatever, impeccably clean beds, beautiful lavatories, and so on. What the photographers who went into the hospitals at the end of the 60s and 70s showed was conditions of extreme neglect. Patients who had been neglected for several years, who were in many ways ill because they'd been institutionalized, not ill because of anything you might just describe as their mental illness. And so, as I said, the paradox of these pictures is that they are inviting us to share a kind of moral indignation about the situation of these people. But in the very process of doing that, they mark these people out as different and as rather strange. This is the kind of strange double quality of all these photographs. And, you know, in other words, they reinforce, I think, what they're trying to denounce, which is this way of making these people other or different or in some other kind of space. And I think the same is true of some photographs of people with disabilities in this period. If you want to look at people and say to your audience, look at this person not as a mad person or a disabled person, not in terms of what they lack or what's strange about their body, but what their body can do, what their abilities are, whether they're the abilities of their person or those bits of their body that work perfectly well, then a photograph can't really capture that. A photograph in some ways is always working against that ability to try and read, to see into these people's lives, those elements of them which are not created by the institutional logic. And if I go through some of the other photographs. If, for instance, you take out this figure on the right, and I do this slightly as a provocation, put him next to a photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe. They're both male nudes, they both have quite good physiques. What's the difference? Well, the difference is the person there shouldn't be photographed naked. It's questionable whether he's consented to this, or whether his family has agreed to have the photograph published. This is not an erotic photograph of a naked man. This is, if you like, an unauthorized representation. Just as photographers in the 1920s and 30s went to African countries or parts of Asia and photographed tribal people naked and took them back to metropolitan centres for white audiences to look at. There is a kind of difference of power between the person photographing and the person being photographed, and it's problematic. So, in the act of taking this photograph, it's clear that Raymond Despardon, the French photographer, wanted us to feel anger and sympathy, but he's making us do that by putting us in the position of people who are in a very different power situation from the people being photographed. And it seems very, very difficult to get away from this logic. Let me just go through some of the other examples. Now, the photographing of naked people is found again and again in these photographs. This is a relatively early one. This is taken from a reportage in Life magazine in 1946, one of the most important ones, with an article by Albert Maisel, which raised the awareness of people in America about the conditions of patients in long-stay psychiatric institutions. But sorry, the point is again the question of the naked woman, this rather emaciated body, and so on. Here's a very famous photograph, very striking, rhetorically very effective, a headless man. He's clearly escaping the photographer. And again, you find in these works by Raymond de Prodon the kind of logic of seeing this place as alienating and frightening. People turned to the wall, people shot in depth away from the camera, people crouching on the floor. This is a clip. I'm just going to show you a short clip from a film that Raymond de Prodon made about the same psychiatric institution in San Clemente in Venice, which is the island hospital that was closed in the 80s. This is a film he made about it in 1980.
Fossile Macaé ai cinecorso. Il fossile Macaé ai cinecorso. Cosa vuol dire? Il fossile Macaé ai cinecorso.
It's one making the horns because of the bad luck of being photographed. These institutions were nearly all built in rather beautiful places. At the time of unification of Italy in 1861, a number of what had been previously aristocratic palaces, noble palaces, were bought by the Italian state and they were used as psychiatric institutions. They're nearly always on the edges of towns, so literally on the spatial margins of a city, or at least they're in a sort of not right in the centre of the major cities. They have beautiful lawns, nice trees, and nearly all the photographs in the late 70s, the time of deinstitutionalization, picked this up. But it seems to me what is picked up is still, as I say, this looking at the strangeness of the person. There were two island psychiatric institutions in the lagoon of Venice. One was San Clemente, which was originally a women's unit, and the other one was San Servolo. Again, you can see the elegant building and the gardens. And when these hospitals closed down, there were many photographs of them as places which in some ways conserve the memory of the violence that had taken place within them. I think this is a slightly fictitious idea because places don't actually carry memories. People project memories onto places. You have to know what went on there in order to have a sense of that. But these photographs have an uncanny quality because you see these beautiful buildings, but with barred windows, or in some cases with windows bricked up so people can't get out of the lower floors. And this unusual long photograph, wide format photograph, in fact a double image, comes from a book that was published in 1969 called Morire di classe, Dying of Class, or From Class, which was a series of photographs done by two photographers, Gianni Berengo Gardin and Carla Cerati, with an introductory text by Franco Basaglia and his wife Franca Ongolo, and then a number of other texts. So the photographs here are contextualized, but they're very shocking. So these photographs, which are about creating a movement against institutionalization, repeatedly confront us with the shock of the institution in place. Sometimes they put a text alongside the image. This is taken from Primo Levi's This Is a Man, to make the comparison between psychiatric institution and the death camp, or the unsanitary laboratories, sometimes repeated in these multiple shots. So again and again this use of the repeated shot, the doubling of the shot, which actually interestingly evokes the 19th century stereoscopic photographs, which you see printed as doubles because you viewed them through a stereoscopic view to make a solid image. Here's one which happens to be of a psychiatric institution. Far from here. And you can see that the American ones are also in beautiful places, with landscape lawns, drives, neoclassical facades. This is the famous octagon on Blackwell's Island, in the East River. Blackwell's Island is now, of course, Roosevelt Island, but it was the island where all social badness was placed. If you look at the map, you can see, reading from left to right, the penitentiary, the almshouse for the poor, the workhouse, the old asylum, and the new asylum. This is the place that Dickens visited in the 1850s. It had only been running for 12 years. The asylum, he said it was a terrible place, which smelt of death. It was the place where Nellie Bly, the young journalist, went and wrote her reportage, 10 Days in a Madhouse, for the New York Globe in the 1890s, and that led to this institution being closed down. So beautiful places on islands, like San Clemente in Venice. San Clemente has now been turned into a luxury hotel. This is the advertising pitch. Okay, so beautiful places with beautiful gardens, and now, of course, with swimming pools and conference centres. They do and they don't carry the memory of what happened within them. When you turn a place like this into a hotel, you can see from the aerial shot, it's exactly the set of buildings that were there from the early 19th century. You in some ways erase any of the memories that have been carried within it. Here's one other example, which is the kitchen block of the Paolo Pini Hospital in Milan, in 2010. And I mention this one because this is where in January 2011, so almost exactly 2 years ago, Marco Paolini, who is a writer and performer, did a performance called Ausmelzen, and this links up with, this is my link back to the other two papers. This was a performance piece running 2 hours, a monologue by Paolini, with a little bit of spoken German by an assistant you can see just over his shoulder there, which reconstructs the history of the Nazi Euthanasia Program. It goes over much of the same ground as what Patricia was describing, not as well as Patricia did it, but much of the same information is there, and in fact he even shows some of the same photographs. He shows the photograph of Kaufbeuren, the one taken by the Americans in July 1945, when they went in there and found that the killing by starvation was still going on. He uses the photograph of Hadamar with the smoking chimney, that clandestine photograph showing the crematorium smoke. So he incorporates photographs of these places into his performance piece. It's also in some ways a good historical lecture. I mean, Paolini's done his research, he's spoken to people, to experts, he's got historians to do work with him. And he turns this into really an account of the genesis of the Nazi euthanasia program. He talks about the spread of eugenics around Europe, around the world in the early 20th century. He talks about the beginnings of sterilization. He talks about the movement towards killing, and then he even cites some letters, some case studies. So it's an interesting piece, but I have some problems with it, and they're similar to the problems that I find in these photographs. That it is, once again, somebody speaking on behalf of other people. What was very beautiful about Patricia's thing was actually hearing these voices of these people, or in your Susan example of this terrible story, I mean, heartbreaking story of this woman who was sterilized as a teenager because she was deaf and then saw her sister having a baby. She held her and burst into tears. I think there's a difference between having protagonists telling their own stories and somebody, if you like, telling their story for them. It puts us in the position of sort of indignant bystanders. And there's something I think emotionally problematic about it. And I just want to leave you with this by showing you a couple of clips from Paolini's monologue, where he appears to become emotionally overwrought.
Quindi quando arrivi comunque sia dignitosamente in questi luoghi, lì si mandava a fare una doccia, ma spesso dopo la doccia non c'era più bisogno d'altro.
Okay, and one other example from slightly later in the performance.
Ho creduto che le mie
Sorry,
preoccupazioni
I should just explain this one, that this is a letter. He was reading out a letter from the mother of a girl, I think a teenage girl, called Elizabeth, and she's been told by the director of the institution where Elizabeth has been confined that she's been sent away, transferred. And the doctor says, we're not quite sure where she has been transferred. And the mother writes back saying, I was about to get a train to visit Elizabeth when your letter reached me. How is it possible that my daughter has been transferred without me being told about it? How is it possible that you, as director of the institution, don't know where she's been transferred? I find this implausible. She says, please let me have my daughter back. I can't face my family, my parents, and tell them that I don't even know where my own daughter is, and so on. So this is the letter he's reading out.
Ho creduto che le mie preoccupazioni iniziali fossero ingiustificate. Non è come diceva la gente, pensavo. Fino ad oggi ho pensato che la ragazza fosse stata data in buone mani. Le chiedo sotto la mia responsabilità di riprendere la ragazza nel suo ospedale. Io la verrò a trovare. È impossibile per me informare i miei familiari di quanto è accaduto. Mi salteranno addosso, mi diranno: non è possibile che tu, sua madre, non sai dov'è tua figlia. Io non posso fare niente, per prima cosa devo sapere dov'è la mia ragazza. Come già detto, mi sembra impossibile che potete trasferire una ragazza senza aver chiesto prima ai genitori. Se succedesse qualcosa alla ragazza, siamo in grado di pagare i funerali.
Now, it is a moving performance, but I do want to criticise it because I think there are some problems with it. And you can see the audience being moved, and I think people here probably are moved listening to the story. But I think it's dishonest in a number of ways. I think it's dishonest because Paolini himself has no real relationship with the people he's writing about. He's simply taking these letters. He's obviously been affected by the stories, and he's presenting them to a public who are moved in turn. So there's a kind of detached relationship from the material. It's dishonest because, as a performer, he's not really feeling the emotion that he conveys. This is Diderot's paradox of the actor. The actor cannot convey emotion if he or she feels emotion at that moment. There has to be a kind of artistic distance from it. And it's dishonest because it draws the public into a kind of emotional complicity. You know, we feel very, very sorry. We feel sad. You can see people, and there are shots of the audience with tears in their eyes. But what's this all about? Surely understanding the Euthanasia Program is not just about giving us a kind of emotional roller coaster ride, making us experience these feelings as if we were there and then go away and feeling better about it or feeling we've understood. Surely it must be about giving us a critical understanding of this, and making us reflect on whether there's any possibility of this kind of thing happening again. The kind of thing that Susan touched on at the end of her talk, that, you know, the science hasn't completely gone away. There's still concern with genetic modelling and so on. In other words, I want to make what you might call a kind of Brechtian critique of this, that there's too much emotion really and not enough thinking going on in this kind of performance. And it brings me back, and I'll conclude on this point, with what I was trying to say about both the power and the problems of those photographs. The photographs, like Paolini's play, are powerful because they give us shocking images. things that make us feel very disturbed. They make us feel compassion for these people, and they make us feel indignation. But they're problematic because they reinforce the idea of these people as somehow different from us, other from us, not part of our common humanity. And they mobilize in some ways the wrong kinds of feelings, I think, in order to produce a critical view of this spatial separation between the normal and the non-normal. Now, you may not agree with me, there's a kind of element of provocation in this talk, but this is something, as I say, which I've reflected on, and I feel pretty sure that I'm not happy about any of these kinds of representation. Thank you.